بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all, and welcome to the third and final lecture of Basira Forum's series, The First Pillar, in which we have been discussing the proofs of God's existence. For those of you joining us for the first time today, my name is Radia. I am the president of Basira Forum and will be the MC today. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are all joining today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This lecture is being recorded and will be made available to you all, inshallah, as will the recordings of the previous 2 weeks. Speaking of, let me very briefly summarize what we discussed in the first 2 lectures, mostly because it serves as a precede to what will come today. So we began with a very interesting talk from Ustad Abdullah Al-Andalusi, who discussed theories regarding the creation of the universe and proved that only a transcendent power has the capacity to create something as intricate and complex as the universe. We brought this discussion back down to earth with Brother Ammar Haq in week 2, who discussed the natural perfection and precision of our everyday surroundings. And we spoke of the importance of reflecting on how majestic even the smallest of creation is. This week brings all of that discussion together to discuss the innate necessity, why we as humans need to believe in a higher power. We will explore the moral, social, and psychological need for humankind to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to lead us through this discussion, it is an immense honor for me to introduce Ustad Talha Bozkurt, who has studied the Islamic sciences extensively across Turkey, Jordan, and the UK. He has recently completed postgraduate studies in modern Islamic thought at the University of Oxford and holds qualifications in theology, philosophy, mysticism, and religious studies. So if that alone doesn't intrigue you for today's lecture, I don't know what will. So with that being said, Ustad Talha, I will hand it over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to first and foremost thank the Basira Forum organizers for this, Sister Radia and her team. May Allah reward you all not only for this particular program, but also the wider initiative of establishing an organization to tackle, I guess, issues that are pertinent to the Muslim community. It's quite an ambitious endeavor, but I believe that with sincerity and effort that Allah will support you all in this journey. And alhamdulillah, this has been a good start so far with I guess this particular series, having good speakers that have preceded me. At the same time, as Sister Radia mentioned, I've sort of been probably given the most challenging of those tasks to deliver, and that is titled The Human Need to Believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are some disclaimers that I would like to share before I do proceed. The first one is the idea of navigating the innate, which is a topic or a term concept that will appear throughout my presentation. Now, obviously, because we're not dealing with the empirical realm through sense perception, it's always a challenge to theorize and articulate the concept of the innate, or what we will see as the Fitrah, or what other disciplines can call intuition, or that innate inward feeling, internal disposition, and so forth. And I think one of the challenges of speaking about the innate, or one of the things that one has to be cautioned in, is that we don't ascribe unconditional or definitive epistemic value to the idea of the inward purely based on human subjectivities. And by that, I mean that when we speak about something that we experience internal, it should not logically flow that therefore this is true. Otherwise, that just opens the door to an infinite possibilities of inward human subjectivities, and they can't all be right, obviously. So we'll be touching upon that, and I think this topic is ever so pertinent today, particularly with developments that are having in some disciplines such as gender identity theory, for example. One of the main arguments for I guess the trans activist movements, or the justification is the idea that this is an inward feeling that individuals have. Now, obviously, without delving into the contentious topic, all I'm trying to do is to warn us that even when we navigate from an Islamic perspective, it's important to remind ourselves that it only follows through that this can be true because of the preceding epistemic resources, and obviously that is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The second is one of the topics that was posed was the idea of the human need for God from a psychological perspective. This is an immense topic in and of itself, and that one that probably requires a distinct lecture, and one that I can't deliver because it's not my specialty. But it's important that when we do speak about psychology or the study of the human psyche, that we don't limit it to a Western paradigm. So it's important that, as I mentioned here, that we do establish an indigenous Islamic theoretical orientation to the topic. And when we do that, we realize that the idea of psychology is actually much more broader and much more representative of the Islamic understanding of what it actually means to be human, what it actually means to practice psychology, and what it actually means to engage as a psychologist. Another thing, the third one, is that it's probably important to underline that need does not equate to pragmatism in the sense of Pascal's wager. So when we speak about the human need for God, it's not, we shouldn't purely look at it from it's the best option. We should look at it as though it's the true option. It's the correct thought process. It's the correct way, and ultimately it's a need that sits on itself. It's a need because of the preceding premises, which will come to, inshallah. So it's not, I need to believe in a God because when I pray, I feel good. I need to believe in a God because when I give charity, it contributes to society. There has to be a greater justification there that transcends, I guess, the individual need. So it shouldn't be that I believe in God because it benefits me, but I believe in God because God is ultimately the one that is worthy of belief and of worship. And just as an aside, that is probably one thing that distinguishes Islamic spirituality from other forms of modern day spiritual practices, modern day New Age movements. And that is that we ultimately engage in these spiritual practices not to better the self, not to feel better, not to unleash the true capacity of oneself, but because Allah Azza wa Jalla is ultimately the one that is worthy of being worshipped. So our spiritual journey to God is because God is worthy of it, not because we want to feel better on a personal level. Although the argument is that that is a consequence of our tazkiyah, of our juhud, of our spiritual struggle. And finally, the most important one is the audacious task at hand. This topic is quite a broad topic. It's not one that I will do justice to. I will say that clearly from the start. It's one that has it's quite multifaceted. I'm not sure how I can speak about the psychological, the moral, and the social components in such short time. So, as I mentioned to the organizers and to the moderators, that I guess the intention behind it would then be that we just want to merely initiate the discussion, speak about essential components that relate to each topic, and hopefully use that as a basis to move forward in our engagement and our navigation of our journey to God, inshallah. So without further ado, I will transition to the actual topic, but I've realized that it's almost 7:20 already, so that just makes it more difficult. Okay. Now, I guess when one idea that sort of is at the forefront of this idea of an internal or an innate feeling or an innate disposition to God is the concept of fitrah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created people in this state of being, or with this state of being, that is attributed to Allah, fitrat Allah. So there is a divine connection in that natural disposition. I will elaborate a bit more on that, but also a hadith that we probably all heard of growing up, especially in Western societies with actual Jews and Christians around us. It probably makes more sense to someone who lives in a predominantly Muslim country and is not really exposed to alternative beliefs in God, alternative theologies and practices and so forth. So the Prophet ﷺ says, no child is born except on al-fitrah, and then his parents make him Jewish, Christian or Magian, as an animal produces a perfect young animal. Do you see any part of its body amputated? I want to just focus on the first part of this hadith, and that is what the Prophet ﷺ says, that كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ, that every single being that comes into existence is born in a state of a natural inclination towards monotheism, a natural inclination towards a belief in God. And then his parents convert him, or through parent pressure or guidance or teachings and so forth, a child shifts away from their internal disposition. Now, let's put this hadith into context. Okay, so there's two important things to consider when we talk about this hadith. First of all, what is inclined by al-fitrah is not that automatically, if you leave this person alone, that he will automatically assume all the theological principles of Islam and just on his own automatically, without external influence, pray, give zakat, give hajj. So what fitrah should be understood here, and it will be elaborated on, is this natural feeling inside of us that we need to feel, we need to believe in a higher transcendent power, i.e. God, an ilah. The second thing to consider, as the scholars of hadith say, is that this should not be limited to abawain, this should not be limited to parents in terms of the external influences that shift a person away from this state of purity. It can also include the social, the different views, different paradigms, dominant paradigms. You can include modern day populism into this, different worldviews, different ideologies that are dominant, the views of the status quo and so forth. So it should be limited to his parents, but also, I guess, the governing ethical ideas that the child is brought up in. And I think when we limit it to that, it may begin to make more sense of how it is that a person can transition into something that has an innate desire to want to believe in a greater power, ultimately in Allah, to I guess disbelieving, not only disbelieving, but as Allah says, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى, have you not seen the one that has taken his own desire as ilah? So ultimately, from this internal disposition into believing, wanting to believe in something greater, to taking the self as thy Lord. And that is important. How does that shift happen? So magnanimously, and that is because the fitrah becomes tarnished, and we will touch upon it inshallah. As fitrah then is the naturally inclination towards the recognition of God and a moral driven life. And I think the second part to this is very important, is that children have this innate desire to want to do good. They're able to discern at stages. And as the research suggests as well in childhood psychology, that children from the earliest stages of development, child development, exhibit an inclination towards good or evil, towards justice, kindness, and empathy for others. Now, it's important to, I guess, clarify that this does not mean that a child, can't bully from a very young age or, inflict pain on others. I guess to look at it from a child psychology perspective, it's important to differentiate between nature with a capital N and nature with a small n. Children can sometimes do actions that are part of their nature, but may be immoral from not from a Sharia perspective, but from a cultural perspective and so forth. And one thing that I've realized, I guess, building upon that idea, is that with my own son, actually, bring it to topic number 3, a toddler's inquisition. My son's just turned, well, he's almost gone to his 2.5, I think, to an 2.8, I should say, turning 3 in a few months. He's just obviously started forming questions, started forming sentences, and he's also forming questions. And the first questions that he asks, you'd think that he's a philosopher, an existential philosopher, asking very deep, profound questions. Where have I come from? Where am I going? Who am I? What am I? And these are actually very difficult questions to answer, even for those of you who probably study philosophy. Philosophers have been grappling with these questions for centuries. And obviously, as Muslims, we have an answer, but I found it interesting that someone who still does not understand what they're saying properly asks questions that have immense ramifications on how they will govern their life moving forward. And so the idea of the fitrah then is thus comprised of a conceptual apparatus with ethical, spiritual, and intellectual processing functions by which the external reality is rendered meaningful and life's journey towards Allah or God is appropriately conceived. So this fitrah is not simply an inward feeling that we have or a sort of internal mechanism, but it's something internal that predates the mithaq, that appropriates to man the conceptual tools to be able to navigate life on a spiritual, intellectual, and moral level. Now, the reality is this then. Why is it that this is not the case? Why do humans sin? Why do humans disbelieve in God? Why do many Muslims, after coming to a certain age, question God? And it comes back to the topic of the nourishing or the cultivation or the preservation of the fitrah, as the Prophet ﷺ says. It is the responsibility of the parents, it is the responsibility of the family, it is the responsibility of the community, and ultimately of the school to preserve this child's inner fitrah. And how does that happen? What's the most effective way to preserve the fitrah? Simply to abide by the fara'id, simply to obey Allah's obligations. They're there to preserve who we are. And they're ultimately there to teach us and remind us what it ultimately means to be a human being. That's probably the best, I shouldn't say the best, but a quick summary of what the purpose of following the Prophet ﷺ is, or one purpose is to remind us of who and what we are and what it means to be human, a human being. Because a lot of the modern discussions that take place, and if you ask me, even looking at colonialism and its influence on Muslim societies, I think one of the greatest calamities that have impacted Muslim societies is that there is a reconception or a redefinition of what it actually means to be a human being, what it means to be a human being, what it means to exist as a human being. And I think once you distort what it means to be human, then it only follows through that different worldviews and different ideas and different conceptions can influence that same human being. So the fitrah is there to preserve our existence ontologically in this world. Okay, the God gene. Some of you may have heard of this idea. I'm not going to delve on this idea, but I'm going to speak about it in a different sense. So obviously neurologists and biologists and so forth are quite interested in the idea of a God gene, in the sense, is there something internally in our physical construct that encourages us or leads us to God? That's not what this topic is about, but it's about the spiritual gene. Is there a spiritual gene in us that ultimately leads us to God? And I guess the answer from a Muslim perspective is yes, there is, and that is the fitrah. And that is why, my brothers and sisters, anybody who has an active concern for their spiritual well-being realizes that when they drift apart, when they fall into an error, when they commit a sin, or when they neglect an action that has been commanded by God, we feel this sense, or we should at least feel this sense of internal resentment, internal remorse, internal regret, internal unease. What the words that I've used are just my the endeavor of language to define what this is. But ultimately, this is that connection with God that is calling us back to Him. And so when we neglect those commands that are there to define us and to connect us to God, we should feel that internal mechanism. And if we're not, our fitrah has to be reassessed. It has to be cultivated. And ultimately, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is there to preserve that and to improve on that, inshallah. From a, I guess, and this is where it can get a bit more theoretical and perhaps probably a bit more contentious, but I just want to put this in there from an Ibn Taymiyyah point of view. Ibn Taymiyyah has an interesting argument. I can't say I agree or disagree with this argument because I haven't read and understood it in its entirety, but I will just summarize it and it may be good. It's called, well, we can call it the argument from Fitrah. According to Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, his student, and other scholars, all the arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument from beauty, argument from nature, the moral argument, all of these in the eyes of Ibn Taymiyyah are considered nullified and considered unacceptable. And the reason for that, to sum up, is because through something that holds a lesser epistemic value, we're trying to validate and verify something that has a greater epistemic value, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. Now, whether one agrees with that or not is a different topic, but I find it interesting that the argument that he posits in its place, in the place of the ontological argument, the teleological argument, and so forth, is actually the argument from Fitrah, what we've sort of been touching on. And for him, this is all based on the Quranic paradigm, or the Quranic epistemology of the notion of Fitrah. A person's faith is fully justified and meaningfully grounded, he argues, without need for logical deductive argumentation. And if you're interested in this particular argument, there are I shouldn't say some, but it's becoming more common now for Western Muslims in Western academia to delve or to research more deeply Ibn Taymiyyah's argument of the concept of the fitrah. Just a quick Google search will bring across some articles. Feel free to research into that. So he further argues, and this is taken from an article which I should have mentioned, it is instead justified because it is the only meaningful outlook that emerges naturally from a person's innate disposition, just like belief in the existence of good and evil, causality, numbers, truth, existence, and so on. So it's a priori. It is Allah exists because Allah exists. We can't say in simple terms that Allah exists X plus Y, therefore God exists. Or you can't put God into a syllogism. Your premise A cannot be everything has a cause, everything has an effect, every effect has a cause, therefore there must be the initial cause. This, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, cannot validate the God's existence. As I said, this is not an argument that I'm positing, but it might be good just to be aware that there is a minority approach within Islamic intellectual history that basically postulates a different alternative to logical deductive argumentation. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, it's the idea of the fitrah, that the meaning that we acquire as human beings from our worship in God, from our submission, from our orientation towards a God-driven life is proof in and of itself. And I haven't done justice to the argument, as I've mentioned, but I just wanted to share that with you. I'm just going to have a look at the time. Okay. So that was the first component. Now the second is from moral necessity. Now this argument, or at least this topic, I find to be quite interesting because of my personal experience. One of the things that I guess strengthened my belief in Islamic scholarship was actually the study of moral philosophy. And it's not that moral philosophy was able to prove the questions that I had on Islam or substantiate some of my beliefs, but it's that moral philosophy was able, or the study of moral philosophy was able to, I guess, destabilize other worldviews that contend to have truth. So every worldview that is espoused by modern within any discipline has certain premises and certain assumptions that lead to ultimately what they deem to be true. It's important that we engage and interrogate these assumptions before we actually engage in the topic that is being discussed. So, for example, the topic of let's say the philosophy of science, empirical, the idea of evidence, the idea of proof, the idea of any form of theory that is produced in modern disciplines. All of these have their own assumptions, and without being aware of those assumptions, to engage in those discussions, I think, will only bear detrimental fruits. So why is this important? Because when it comes to the idea of good and evil, or having a moral compass, you need a strong moral ground. The epistemic basis in which you stand upon must be strong, consistent, and coherent, and even today must be rational. It should be, one should be able to rationalize the thought process. So from this, and much can be said of this, but I guess the idea that I'm trying to convey here is that as Muslims, we also have our own moral compass, our own morality. We should be able to articulate and express why it is that we believe in what we believe through an understanding of the knowledge, tools that are used to come to that actual conclusion rather than working backwards. So as Muslims, we rest upon the Quran and Sunnah. This is the basis for our moral compass. So good and evil can good and evil be determined through reason or through revelation? And both is not the topic that I want to delve upon, because I probably won't be able to exit that. But I think it's important to know that everything as Muslims that we accept and disagree with must be grounded in some form of morality. And the epistemic basis of that morality must be sound and consistent. But it's not only that what you are believing is true, but it should follow through that it has inward and outward benefits on you. And that is why there has to be a correlation between morality and spirituality. Is that when you live a moral, God-driven life, ultimately there should be a spiritual benefit on you from a Muslim perspective. Okay, this is common in other disciplines, other traditions as well. But as Muslims, our one should not be based, it should not follow through that because I'm having this spiritual journey, therefore it must be true. Our one is true is that because of the consistency of my morality, that this must reap spiritual benefits. And that is why the idea of tazkiyah, the idea of a spiritual struggle, or what classical scientists call the science of tasawwuf, for example. These are all an experiential way of engaging with the theory and seeing that the theory leads to the experience. In I guess more simple ways, it should begin with knowledge, ilm. That ilm should translate into hal, which is a state of that knowledge, and that hal should translate into amal, into action. What should that action change into? Dhawq, spiritual taste. We should feel, for example, prayer. You know to pray, you stand up and pray, but sometimes you stand up and you pray, and you realize that I've just literally moved my limbs. I've just prostrated, but I haven't actually felt anything inwardly. That's because the dhawq isn't there, the taste isn't there. Why? Because there's a shortcoming in our engagement with the physical. There's a shortcoming in our engagement with the spiritual realm. If all of those are in sync, that spiritual taste comes about. And this should continue in the form of a taraqqi. There should be a spiritual ascension that constantly takes place. And that is why the prayer was called Mi'rajul Mu'min, the ascension of the believer. But coming back to the topic, it's important that our grounds for belief in a God should follow through, that there is a consistency in our morality. And that I can tell you that for us to say that I don't eat pork, for example, because God says so, is a much stronger argument than somebody trying to justify the opposite. Or to say that, for example, that I don't think pork is moral to eat because of X, Y, Z. Because the premise for us, it precedes with God's existence, first proving that God exists. So as you probably saw in episode 1 and episode 2, after you've established God's existence, it then follows through that God interacts with human beings. Then the belief in prophethood comes about very shortly. Then through the belief in prophethood, these prophets obviously send a message. These messages are codified, formulated into what we call a religion or deen. And ultimately, when you compare Islam with the other religions, based on the sound understanding of monotheism, we come to the moral teachings of Islam. And that is why that is important, that there is that epistemic basis or strong epistemic basis that governs our morality. Otherwise, we have what we have today. a relativistic understanding of what should be good and what shouldn't be good, one that is guided by what we said at the start, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ, the human whim, or the economy, or capitalism, or the human desire to want to exploit itself and those around it, and the less powerful. Afwan. And I think my final slide is the social need. Now, I'm not sure of how the organizers requested for the moral, the social, and the psychological to be tackled, but I've put together something that I think may be of benefit. Now, the social need, I think when you think of God in the concept of his relationship with society, it's important to come back to the basic understanding of Tawheed. Now, I want to underscore that Tawheed should not be minimized to just a mere belief in one God. Tawheed is much greater than a belief in one God. Just looking at the Arabic root words of Tawheed, the word wahada reminds us that it's a recurrent practice, that there's a constant unification that is taking place in our engagement with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as a result, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's relationship with the material and immaterial realm. So this idea, it's important that we do have this sound connection with God, because then we have unity, harmony, and unification in all of our engagement with the physical and the metaphysical realm, in societies, in our engagement with knowledge, in our engagement with people of different orientations, in our engagement with alam al-ghayb, in our engagement with the realm of the unseen. And when this happens, we have true balance. And this is the argument, basically, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inni ja'inun fil ardi khalifa, that on earth I established a vicegerent, a khalifa. And the purpose of that vicegerent is to practice and establish God's sharia. And from that, which is basically centered on the idea of Tawheed, there should be balance on the earth. Now, I want to just share with you a book that I'm currently reading by Ahmed Paul Killer. The book is titled Rethinking Islam and the West. And basically in this book, he interrogates the modern idea of what progress actually means. His argument is that there is quite a reductive idea of progress that is limited to scientific progress, technological advancement, and economic growth. And his argument is that this is actually not progress, because what we're seeing is that it is actually harming society. It is harming climate change. It is leading to the destruction of the environment. So he calls for an alternative, one based on the Quranic concept of mizan, which means balance. In Surah Ar-Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the mizan in the first page, and he articulates it as the spiritual, social, and material balance. So it's not only progress in one realm, but progress in multiple realms. And the argument is that when there is equal emphasis given on the spiritual, social, and material, that is when we will have ultimate balance. But this can only be true when it's grounded in the idea of Tawheed, because the spiritual is ultimately guided by Allah's Sharia, the social is guided by Allah's Sharia, and the material is guided by Allah's Sharia. So ultimately this comes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the consequences, at least the material consequences and the immaterial consequences of believing in that one God, is that it brings balance on a cosmological level. And this is where the powerful idea is of Islam, as Ahmed Killer tries to articulate, comes into play. So the social need stems, society needs God, God does not need society, and when there is that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when ultimately society will flourish and thrive. And if you look at And he critiques the golden age of Islam as well, the notion that there was a golden age of Islam, because ultimately it's very difficult to determine spiritual progress. It might be that, people in the Third World War are more spiritually advanced than Muslims living in First World War countries. What criteria actually determines growth and balance and progress? If we look at it from a spiritual perspective, from a and I guess for Islam paradigm, it might be that, somewhere, some country in South Asia might be considered a first world country, and the West is a third world country spiritually. What is the basis? So it's important that we interrogate these criterions that are there to sort of compartmentalize society based on a criteria that Islam doesn't necessarily approve of. So just to sum up, I guess from a moral, psychological, and social need perspective, we need God in our engagement with the psychology, with society, for our morality and for our own psychological well-being, and not vice versa, as I've tried to explain. Because ultimately, when that connection there is with God, we thrive and flourish on an individual, moral, intellectual, and spiritual level. I do want to apologize if my talk has been somewhat incoherent and I guess not well researched. I would probably like to concede that it was quite an ambitious task to speak about these three topics in the time that was given. However, the intention was to I guess plant seeds for further thought and for further discussion, and inshallah that's the intention. If there are any questions, it might be an apt time to pose them, but I would like to thank you for listening and being patient with me, and I'd like to pass the microphone back to Sister Radia, inshallah. And Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallahu khairan, Ustad. That was not incoherent at all. This is a very difficult topic, as you've mentioned, and honestly, the things that you were mentioning were truly fascinating. I think particularly going into